All right, everybody, I think that we can go ahead and get started. So again, thank you guys so much for coming. This is a super special event that we've been looking forward to. Everybody's microphones should remain muted if y'all don't mind, so that we can clearly hear each speaker. We'd love to see your smiling faces if you want to turn on your camera, but if not, that is all right as well. And if you do have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and put those in the chat box, which is located near the bottom of your screen, and we will make sure that these are being recorded and we'll get to them by the end of the event. So I just want to super quickly reiterate why we're all here today and what Organizing Together 2020's mission is. We are a community-based, volunteer-driven organizing campaign designed to get operational earlier than ever before in order to build a strong infrastructure for this election coming up in the fall. But today's mission is to kind of bring the attention to the specific environmental and climate issues that are extremely urgent, and to provide our community the opportunity to hear from experienced individuals from various different backgrounds on these issues. So I'd like to introduce our moderator, John Capece. He's an agricultural engineer who serves as the Kissimmee Waterkeeper. There are 14 waterkeeper organizations here in Florida, which are all a part of the Waterkeeper Alliance with 350 member organizations globally. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to John.
All right, thank you, Lily. And thank you to Organizing Together 2020 for making sure that voters pay close attention to the climate emergency issue. And as Lily said, I serve as the Kissimmee Waterkeeper. Years ago, I had started up the organization and recently transitioned it to Calusa Waterkeeper, but I've switched and am now focusing on the Kissimmee. And the Kissimmee Waterkeeper will have a slightly different approach in that it will balance the issues of water quality and hydrology with climate change, because those issues today and have always been incredibly intertwined. You can't really address one without addressing the other. And that's important for Southwest Florida because we care so much about the water issues, but we can't solve those without also addressing the climate emergency. So for people my age, rapidly approaching 60, we first started hearing about climate change in the mid-1970s. And by the 1980s, it was, we were hearing alarm bells being sounded at the national level. But at that time, it was all science-based projections. We really couldn't actually feel climate change back in the 80s. However, by the early 2000s, anyone living in Florida could begin to personally sense the changes. Now, today, it's absolutely impossible to ignore. It's in our face almost every day as we walk out the door. The scientific data is even more alarming. Arctic sea ice is rapidly shrinking in area and mass. Waters are flooding off of Greenland as its glaciers thaw. Around Florida, the tropical Caribbean, Gulf, and Atlantic waters are warming, and hurricane destruction is dramatically increasing. Even without storms, ocean water now regularly fills the streets of Miami. Our oceans are acidifying, causing stress and damage to sea life. On land, plants and animals are also experiencing stress as both the air temperature and rainfall patterns become more severe. But we know all this. We hear it in the news all the time. We feel it. But today we're going to hear some things we don't normally. We have 4 panelists who are trying to help society address the climate emergency. They will tell us about their efforts and maybe some of their recommendations. So our panelists are Miss Valholly Frank, Mr. Rock Aboujaoude Jr., Dr. Mark Paul, and Mr. Rob Patten. Each of them will provide a short 5 to 10 minute commentary, and then we'll go into a question and answer session. If you would like to submit a question for the Q&A session, please write it in the chat window as you think of them, and we'll make note of your question. So first, Miss Valholly Frank. Valholly's 17 years old. She's a member of the Seminole tribe of Florida. There we go. And she attends the Sagemont School in Weston. She was a presenter at the 2019 United Nations Climate Change Conference of Youth and an official NGO observer at the 2019 UN Climate Change Conference meeting in Madrid, COP25. Valholly is also one of the 8 youth plaintiffs in Reynolds v. State of Florida, suing the state on its failure to properly address climate change. So Valholly, clearly you've had a very unique set of experiences for a 17-year-old. Can you tell us more about your participation in the climate change issue, the legal action in Florida, the UN conference that you attended, and your motivations for taking up these issues?
Yeah, thank you. As you heard, my name is Valholly Frank. I'm 17 years old, and I am one of the 8 youth plaintiffs on the Reynolds versus the State of Florida lawsuit. That lawsuit is basically 8 youth and some wonderful lawyers coming together to sue the state on behalf of the climate crisis. We are suing because of the action the state has taken to further the effects of climate change. And what we're suing for isn't for damages or money or anything. We're suing for a stable climate plan, a climate recovery plan that would set us on track to divest from fossil fuel use and to go into more renewable energy. I have always been involved in a lot of environmental issues and social justice issues in general, and I've been involved with them for as long as I can remember because of my mom. She is an amazing activist, and she brought me up in a way that I think is really special for someone my age. There are a lot of activists nowadays, but especially like where I go to school and where like I'm around people my age, they usually have to teach themselves about what I've been taught throughout my life. And I think it's really hard for you to find a connection, find a passion when you aren't brought up with that. But another reason that I'm so invested in environmental issues is because I'm Native American. I'm part of the Seminole tribe, and our tribe is, or at least in my reservation on the Big Cypress Reservation, it's located in the Everglades, and I grew up out here, and I only moved out of the res a few years ago, and we still have a house here, which I'm currently at, and I grew up in this immersion of nature, and I never realized that a lot of kids don't experience the outside in the way that I have. My mom has this wonderful picture of me on her back as a kid as she's hiking through to see a ghost orchid, a very, very rare orchid in the state of Florida down here in the Everglades. And it was hot and muggy and gross, and I looked so upset, like you've never seen so much emotion displayed from a toddler. And I always took for granted growing up out here. I always took for granted being around all this nature and being able to see the things I've seen. But I'm starting to understand it and appreciate it more ever since I moved to the city or into a more urban area. I live in Weston now, and it's just this little Thneedville. It's everyone there lives in a bubble. And I take an environmental science class at my school, and my teacher's always reinforcing the fact that everything is connected and that everything matters and that you are one with the earth. And I never realized that kids just didn't understand that people in general just didn't understand that. But the way I was raised to understand that, like, I come from dirt and I will become dirt. Like, I am one with this earth and I have to protect everything around me. I went up to New York recently for a conference with other Native American tribes and other Native Americans, and I was lucky enough to meet all these wonderful people and hear what they had to say. And one of them brought to my attention this belief. One of them brought to my attention this 7 generations belief, where what you're doing right now, it has to be something that won't affect a person within the next 7 generations. So if you are doing something in this moment that is going to harm the next 7 generations, even one person, you should not do that thing. You have to live sustainably and live in harmony with the earth. And one thing I like to draw attention to is that during this crisis, it's shown that we should act and that we can act. And people are saying they want to go back to normal, they want to go outside, they hate the quarantine. And I'm sure everyone does. But everyone's saying they want to go back to normal, but I think we have to move forward past normal, because normal was a crisis. Normal was not something we should be striving for. And I hear people talk about our past governor, or Ron DeSantis even. They'll say, oh, at least Ron DeSantis is better than Rick Scott, but we should not be setting our bar at Rick Scott. It should not be that low. You can't compare the two, because it's just the lesser of two evils. We have to strive for something better. We can't go back to what we were. We have to move forward and move past this. And I think the youth are really starting to see that, and they're starting to move for this. And it's wonderful to see so many people who are supporting us. And I love what I do. And I'm so proud to be a part of this lawsuit, because I think it's really getting my voice out there, especially as someone who can't vote or can't do anything very monumental, you might say. But I think I'm really making a difference, and I think I'm helping.
Well, thank you, Valholly. That was a nice introduction. Next, we'll go to Rock Aboujaoude Jr. And if I can bring up my slide here. I don't have screen sharing permission at this time, so I'll just introduce Rock. Mr. Rock Aboujaoude Jr. is 23 years old and a recent graduate of the University of Florida, earning a bachelor's degree in natural resource economics. During the 2020 legislative session, Rock worked as a senior legislative analyst focused on environmental legislation for the Florida Senate in Tallahassee. Rock is from Southwest Florida, born and raised in Alva near Fort Myers. He is currently preparing to pursue a master's degree in economics and environmental policy. So Rock, given that you've attended the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Paris in 2015, and then the next year in Marrakesh, Morocco, and then Bonn, Germany, and Katowice, Poland, and then most recently Madrid, Spain. Can you explain the UN process and what it is accomplishing to address the climate change emergency?
Sure. First of all, can everyone hear me? Fantastic. What about my screen? Can everyone see it?
Yep.
Excellent. All right. So first of all, let's go through a quick talk about what these climate conferences are. There are the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they were created in 1992 with the express mandate to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. Now, this was first created in 1992, or the vision for it was first created in 1992 with the express intention to save us all from certain disaster. So the UNFCCC originally created the idea of creating a conference of parties, with the essential idea of having an annual meeting for the United Nations to come together with representatives, delegates, diplomats, corporate representatives, and NGOs to kind of deal with these climate change issues from around the world in some sort of annual conference, kind of follow up with what everyone's doing. And the first major milestone for these conferences was, of course, the Kyoto Protocols, which was originally put together in 1994 and finally signed by an overwhelming majority of nations in 1996, with the original intention of limiting greenhouse gas emissions. Ideally, every single conference, we should be following up with our goals with regard to the Kyoto protocols, making sure that we're meeting our greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, with the benefit of hindsight, it seems that we haven't exactly met those emissions, but I'll get to that in just a moment. Also held just 3 days prior to each of these United Nations gatherings is, of course, the Conference of Youth, which, of course, is, I was privileged to attend it with Valholly this year in Madrid, Spain. They essentially bring together passionate youth from around the world. Usually these are adult leaders in high school, graduate students, or in college, essentially youth leaders who are working on these solutions from a youth perspective. Now, this year we had in a wonderful time. We attended Chile. We attended COP25 in Madrid, of course, which was brought together under the banner of Chile. It was a fantastic event, but it just goes to show that for every single year that we've attended these, we're consistently hearing the same old stuff. We're hearing, yes, we're every single year, we're finally doing something about climate change. We're finally following up with our goals for climate change. Well, unfortunately, every single year we do hear those same interpretations that, yes, Madrid this year is going to be the final solution to our problems, or Paris was, or Bonn was, or Marrakech was. But every year it's still the same old story of a repeated succession of failures where greenhouse gas emissions aren't necessarily being, or the limits that were established by first the Kyoto protocols and then the Paris Climate Accords aren't being listened to or adhered to by any of the nations who are attending or any of the nations or delegates or corporate fellows who are attending these events. In fact, in Paris, which Dr. Capece and I attended back in 2015, there was much ado about how we are establishing a new framework, how these are amazing goals that we're achieving. And this is kind of like a great milestone. And for somebody who is just out of high school or in high school, like me, it was a big deal. Unfortunately, that hasn't exactly proved successful given the fact that we've pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords and how the rest of the nations of the world, on average, don't seem to be exactly achieving those goals and standards. In fact, as you can see here, since Kyoto, and this infographic goes back to essentially 2017. This isn't even updated to 2020, but you can see here that most of the nations throughout the world have drastic percentage increases since Kyoto, not percentage decreases, which is something that we really wanted to shoot for. And that really boils down to the question of why aren't we getting anything done on an international perspective, right? We consistently have these international agreements such as the Kyoto protocols or the Paris Climate Accords, but there's two problems with that. The first is these protocols and accords, they're not exactly binding. They're not something that says if you don't miss it, or that if you miss this, there's going to be stringent regulations, or there's going to be an issue if you don't meet these goals. There's nothing like that. These are agreements that we're generally expected to achieve, not exactly forced to agree to them. And second lies in the types of folks who attend these events. We can assume that about half of them, or at least through my experience, I would say, about half of these delegates and folks are people who actually care about the science. They're the doers, they're the ladder builders, those who care about actually doing something about climate change. And then there's, of course, the other half, those who are the political people or the Trump representatives who go to these events and put their career goals and interests first, if not actively stymie the attempts to work towards these greater goals and achieve greenhouse gas emission limits, so on and so forth. So, at these COP gatherings, many of them take place with the intention to hold what we call negotiations, where the industrialized world or the post-industrialized world deals with the pre-industrialized world. So nations like Africa, who are in the process of industrializing, and China and India deal with the Western powers who are in post-industrialization and can sometimes help these nations achieve their goal reduction limits. Anyway, to get back to KOI, the youth side of things, it's sometimes even worse than the COP gatherings. Many of the youth who attend these events are aggressive and very pushy in their career goals and interests. And many of them see COI, the Conference of Youth, which, as I mentioned, takes place just prior to the Conference of Parties, as merely a vehicle for their own political ambitions, and see this as sometimes even a party or a place to take a couple Instagram photos and say, yes, we're doing something about solving climate change, but in reality, not doing much at all. And this is something that organizations like ours, Campus Climate Corps, really focus on the issues. We are mostly graduate students bringing together the science and the technical aspects. If you see our logo here, it's a person pushing back against the waves, if you'll notice. Now, this goes back to the Greek myth of, or the Greek mythology of Sisyphus. If you'll remember from, if any of you are familiar with the Greek myths, the hubris and ego of Sisyphus transgresses against the god's vision for Sisyphus, and they forever condemn Sisyphus to push a boulder up a mountain, only for that boulder to fall right back down the mountain. And Sisyphus has to do this for the rest of eternity. And this is kind of showing what we are dealing with on the border, with regard to climate change. We are forever condemned because of our hubris and our consumption, consumer as society, to forever be pushing back against climate change now and deal with the symptoms of the problem simply because we're not addressing the root of the problem of climate change. And yeah, so what we are doing is we're attempting to refocus and retool our universities and focus on addressing some of the root causes of climate change. And my personal background being resource economics, like Dr. Capece said, I'm going to plan on going to grad school for resource economics to attempt to deal with the agricultural issues with regard to climate change. One thing that I'll wrap up with here is if you guys have seen it, I would highly suggest that you watch it. The Michael Moore movie, what is it, Planet of the Humans, is definitely an interesting movie to watch because it really highlights some of the clashes between even environmental groups, and some even environmental groups can misunderstand what the true issues are with regard to climate change, what is sustainable and what is not. And it really goes to show how we need to focus on the numbers, because this really, truly is a numbers game. And we're only going to solve climate change by paying attention to those numbers and solving climate change with not the politicians, but the scientists, and the scientists who explain to us what are the numbers and what do they mean. So not like in the instance of the United Nations, which the take-home message for that is, don't rely on the United Nations to save us from climate change. They're structurally incapable of solving these issues. In fact, what is going to solve these issues is governments and corporations who might actually be, when they're finally done profiting off of climate change, to let the United Nations, almost like their peacekeepers, finally solve the issue after the fact, after it's done. So the idea is we need to focus on these issues here at home and developing these technical solutions here at home by, first of all, understanding that numbers game and listening to the scientists on where we need to go with that numbers game.
Okay, well, thank you, Rock. So our next speaker will be Dr. Mark Paul. Mark is 32 years old. He's an assistant professor of economics and environmental studies at New College of Florida in Sarasota. He earned his bachelor's and doctorate degrees at University of Massachusetts, Amherst, and he was a postdoctoral research associate at Duke University. In addition to his New College position, Dr. Paul has 2 think tank appointments. He is a senior fellow at Data for Progress and a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute. The Roosevelt Institute is associated with the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. So Dr. Paul, I'd like to ask a somewhat lengthy question designed to invite you to talk about your economics philosophy as it applies to the climate emergency. Going back a little before your time, there was a professor named Howard T. Odom at the University of Florida, and he developed the science of systems ecology back in the 1970s and 80s. His approach eventually came to be called emergy analysis, and that's emergy with an M, meant to represent embodied energy. It captures, in a way, how engineers and biologists quantitatively tend to think about the issues that you deal with as an economist. Now, Professor Odom also studied what is called the maximum power principle, which states that all biological systems, including people, including humans, naturally evolve to maximize their energy consumption and eventually their efficiency. So given the biological underpinnings of economics, my question is, how can traditional economics be applied to help us deal with the climate change realities and convert to renewable energies quickly enough to save ourselves?
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy lives to join us for this event. First off, before I get going, I just want to mention I shared a comment in the side here. I really enjoyed Rock's comments. However, I think part of this is also, making sure that we have hard discussions. And I and a number of other climate experts actually wrote a letter debunking a great deal of what Michael Moore talked about in that recent film that I think should not be classified as a documentary. And I just shared a piece that one of my colleagues wrote about the film for Vox, where it kind of debunks a whole host of the attacks that he launches on the environmental movement. So that said, I'm an economist, not a climate scientist, though I would work and write with climate scientists frequently. Which is always a pleasure. It's great to work with folks who see these issues quite differently from yourself. What I want to do today is just briefly talk about how economists traditionally see the climate crisis and respond to the climate crisis, and why that has really prevented us from passing bold climate action, and how we can think about moving forward, given that we are really facing a cliff in terms of inaction and what it will do for humanity. So right now, of course, we're in the midst of multiple interrelated crises. So we're having this event online in part due to COVID. Most of us are quickly getting acquainted with Zoom and other online technologies as we are unable to leave our houses or our neighborhoods. And that's not the only crisis we're dealing with, though. We're also dealing with the climate crisis, and we're dealing with the economic crisis as well. And when I say the economic crisis, I'm not only referring to the current crisis that we're seeing due to the fallout from COVID, but we're also talking about a larger structural economic crisis. So if you think about how the economy was doing just before COVID hit, a lot of folks talked about the economy being near full employment, operating on full cylinders, et cetera. Yet we still had over 40 million Americans living in poverty. More than 40% of Americans could not afford a $400 expense. Today we have over 20% of Americans unemployed. And before COVID, actually, for the first time in recorded history, unemployment numbers for Black Americans dipped right below 7%. Unemployment numbers for white Americans have actually never been above 7%, except for during recession times. So in other words, we've basically kept, through policy measures, the Black community in a permanent recession since we started gathering data on this in 1948. So we have all these crises that we have to try to address together, and the economy is a large and interconnected system. And so the reason I mention COVID and the reason I mention our structural inequality crisis is because when we think about addressing the climate crisis, we can't think about doing so in isolation. So a lot of people, for instance, have attacked policies like the Green New Deal because they link social policy with climate policy. But the fact of the matter is that a large restructuring of the economy that is necessary in order to engage in a program of crash decarbonization and stabilize the climate at 1.5 or 2 degrees C of warming requires massive redistribution of resources. And if you let that happen haphazardly, what tends to occur is that you exacerbate existing inequalities. So in other words, people who are already disadvantaged in our society will lose out, while people who are already privileged will continue to benefit. So one example of that, I, for instance, have an electric vehicle. I benefited from the government's electric vehicle tax incentives. I am thankful for that policy. I think it's a good policy, both as a climate economist and as a beneficiary of it. But a large swath of Americans can't afford an electric vehicle because the cheapest one you can currently buy is $38,000 in the United States. And to boot, the only way you can get the subsidy is if you have an income high enough where you can actually write off that tax credit. I say this because when we're engaging in climate policy, we're engaging in redistributive policies in the first place. So we need to be smart about how we design them and think about how can we mitigate inequality and emissions simultaneously. So unfortunately, for far too long, as many of you have probably heard, economists have told us that climate action is simply too costly, and it will slow economic growth, it'll lead to mass layoffs, it'll devastate the coal and fossil fuel industry, which will wreak havoc on the economies of key regions like West Virginia, Kentucky, South Dakota, and other fossil fuel dependent regions. And we're kind of damned if we do and we're damned if we don't. Economists do often offer a modest proposal in the form of a small carbon price as a way to address climate change's most pressing issues. For me, I study carbon prices a lot, and I'd be happy to talk about them more during the question and answer, but that's just one small piece of the tool set that the policymaker can and should utilize in order to actually address the climate crisis. Thankfully, in my work with my co-authors, what we've done is we've highlighted two things. First, we've looked at what we call the neoliberal straitjacket that's really hamstrung climate action, not just within the Republican Party, but also the Democratic Party as well. When Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency after President Obama was elected, they did not push very hard in trying to pass bold climate action. Waxman Markey was introduced. It was groundbreaking legislation, and unfortunately, the administration decided not to put its weight behind it. And in the interim, we've seen Democrats introduce half measures on climate time and time again. So I think it's really important to notice that denialism, which is what we've tended to see from the Republican Party, is certainly deadly, but delay, which is what we've largely seen from the Democratic Party, is also deeply troubling as well. So we need to make sure that we are holding Democrats accountable for thinking about developing policy responses that actually take the climate scientists seriously and will help us stabilize our planet and rapidly reduce emissions in a way that does not cause irreparable harm to our livelihoods. So the second part of our work, though, has been thinking about, is there actually this firm trade-off between the economy and the climate? Or could we actually simultaneously reduce emissions and build a more equitable society through an investment-led approach? And what we found through multiple reports and papers that I and co-authors have written is that if we have an investment-led strategy to addressing the climate crisis, we can create millions of family-sustaining jobs that are well-paying union jobs across the country, including locating many of those jobs through industrial policy in fossil fuel regions to help transition fossil fuel workers from, say, oil and gas workers to wind and solar workers. There's actually now more than twice as many wind and solar jobs, for instance, in the Southeast region, including Florida, as there are fossil fuel jobs at this time. So we need to continue to think about how to transition those workers. And we can, at the same time, increase economic growth rather than curtail it. So there isn't actually a trade-off between economic growth and a more resilient economy that will preserve a habitable planet. In order to do this, though, the economy is going to need to undergo massive structural changes. The way that we talk about these changes with policymakers is really lumping action into three broad buckets. So the first one is investment. This means that the government's going to have to go out there and actually build a lot of new things. That ranges from retrofitting buildings. Buildings, as a matter of fact, account for 40% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. All of us live in homes. Many of us go to offices during normal times, perhaps not right now. And most of those buildings are highly inefficient. Most of them also contain greenhouse gases. Maybe some of you have gas stoves or a gas furnace, things like that. So we need to rapidly decarbonize buildings through largely direct investment. But investment also includes channeling private investment. So you can do that through things like green banks. Again, happy to talk about later. But the Obama administration actually did a great deal of this under the Affordable Care Act in 2008, 2009. And right now I'm working with a whole host of candidates currently running for office, including Vice President Biden, and thinking about how they can develop smart climate policies for an investment-led approach to bring us out of this current economic crisis we find ourselves in. So second from investment, we also need smart regulations. So the two regulations that have actually done the heaviest lifts in terms of reducing emissions to date in the United States are Capece standards, which are corporate average fuel economy standards, but that's basically the mandates that improve the fuel efficiency of your vehicles. So today our vehicles get about 3 times as many miles per gallon on average as they did in 1974 when the first improvement to vehicle fuel efficiency was initially passed. And the second one is what we call renewable portfolio standards. So that basically dictates, say in the state of Florida, we could pass a renewable portfolio standard that says 50% of our energy must come from clean and renewable sources by 2030 and 100% by 2040. Unfortunately, in the Southeast, these policies are relatively rare, but we have a whole host of states across the country that have shown that these policies are both achievable and actually build more resilient economies rather than lead to displacement and economic harm. And the final thing is what I call, quote, getting prices right. So this includes 2 things. So right now, we don't pay for polluting. So you and I drive our vehicles, turn on our air conditioners, heat our pools, and we do not pay for the pollution that causes. We could fix that by placing a carbon price on all fossil fuels in the United States. And happy to talk more about what that policy might look like. But that's not all. Rather than simply making pollution free in the United States, we actually currently subsidize pollution very heavily. In the US, we pay about $20.5 billion right now in subsidies to fossil fuel companies at the city, state, and federal level. That number largely comes from an Obama administration report that they produced back in 2012 that we've adjusted since. So, it seems like it should be common sense that we should simply stop paying the polluters for killing us right now. And we can certainly put those resources to much, much better uses as quickly as possible. So lots of other things that I'd love to talk about, but for time, I'll just finish in mentioning one thing. A lot of people think about, the environment as just one other part of the economy, but it's not. As John mentioned at the beginning here, the biological underpinnings of our economy right now is precisely what's at stake. If we lose the climate, it's not like we're going to experience a short-term reduction in living standards, right? It's not like a few of us are going to lose our jobs. A few of us might lose our homes to extreme weather events, things like that. If we allow the planet to warm to 4 degrees C, which it's currently on track to do by the end of the century, most of our communities are literally going to be gone. I, for one, live in Sarasota, and in our town, in Sarasota, I know that not only are the keys going to be gone if we continue with business as usual by the end of the century, but the entire downtown gone. I don't have a flood map pulled up right now, but I encourage you to go onto NOAA's website and check out the flood maps. I mean, they're really devastating. So we're really talking about mass devastation on a planetary scale if we don't act and don't act quickly. The encouraging thing, though, is that we have the know-how to decarbonize the economy. We can engage in a program of crash decarbonization. The only thing that's holding us back at this moment is the political will to do so, which is why organizations like this are so important to get the right people elected and to hold them accountable once they're in office to make sure they pass the policies that are necessary to build a more resilient and just economy that benefits all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Paul. Those were some very interesting comments. Generates a lot of questions in my mind, and I'm sure the others. So hopefully we can get to some of those later on. Our next speaker is Rob Patten. And Mr. Rob Patten is 71 years old, and he's retired, living near the Myakka River. He has a political science degree from SUNY Buffalo. That's the State University of New York at Buffalo. His graduate degree is in ecology from Syracuse University. Rob worked as a marine specialist for the New York Extension Service, where he was responsible for water quality and fisheries management programs for Lake Erie. After that, he was a marine biologist with Sarasota County and later served as Director of Natural Resources and the Executive Director of Environmental Services. He was responsible for water and stormwater utilities, solid waste, sustainability, natural resources, permitting, etc. Mr. Patten was also chair of the PAC, the Political Action Committee, to approve the Environmental Sensitive Lands Program referendum for Sarasota County. And 69% of their voters supported this, passing the referendum to tax themselves for 25 years. I guess this was back in 1999 or so, to buy and protect land for use as public preserves. And I think so far, the program has raised over $250 million. And to put that in perspective, when we go to the state legislature to try to get funding for the entire state land purchases, we're lucky to walk away in a year with anywhere from $10 to $100 million. So $250 million is an incredible accomplishment for a single county. After leaving government, he created Aquaterra Design Group and Coastal Dunes Associates, and both of these are environmental consulting and coastal restoration companies that work throughout the USA and Caribbean. Now that Rob's retired, he's still, helping to fight the good fight. So Rob, you have decades of experience in government administration and environmental consulting. So you know exactly how long-term considerations of land and water management run up against day-to-day government processes and politics. And you've also spent decades right there in the Sarasota area. So can you tell us about the changes you've personally seen in the Florida climate and also its political climate, as well as people's attitudes on climate change?
Sure. And thanks, John, for putting this together. You've done a lot of work to make this successful. I appreciate that. It's always disheartening to hear, you have decades of experience. You don't want to think of yourself at a certain age, but decades of experience.
I'm right there with you, there with you.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some specific examples of how climate emergency and climate change has affected our local government. But I'm also going to talk, at least half of what I want to say has to do with how do we take these specific pieces of information we have and how do we defeat Trump? That's kind of what we're here for. So I'm going to start by just telling you I'm a Florida native. I've lived in Jacksonville, Miami, and Sarasota for over 60 years, and I grew up in the St. Johns River. Now, the older Florida that I remembered was sparsely populated. It was racially segregated. It had many beautiful natural places. There were small cottages on the barrier islands. There were no mansions. There were a few bridges, mostly were two-lane roads, no alligator alley, no interstate. Major industries were citrus and cattle. So that sounds like a real idyllic Mayberry kind of thing, but we had some real problems too. We had serious problems brewing. The bays were becoming terribly polluted, and we were dredging and filling every wetland we could find at a ridiculous rate. So from an environmental standpoint, we were headed in the wrong direction. And today I look around and what I see is not one Florida, I see three Floridas. I see coastal Floridas, I see the rural agricultural Florida, and I see Orlando, which I consider to be its own animal. So these three Floridas, let me just, I'm a pilot and I fly over the state. I've done it 500 or 600 times. If you can imagine taking off with me in my plane at nighttime, here's what's going to happen. We're going to fly to 5,000 feet from Sarasota, and you're going to see this maybe 5 minutes worth of this line of lights that goes up and down the coast. And then for about 45 minutes, it's going to be dark, except for Okeechobee and maybe Acadia. And then the last 10 minutes, right before we land in Palm Beach, you're going to see another bright light of lights along the Atlantic Ocean. So we have these two thin lines of about 1,300 miles of coastline that surround something that's not what most people are used to. And that's why Florida faces some of the starkest risks from our climate emergency discussion, whether it's rising oceans or higher temperatures spawning more destructive storms or the loss of valuable wetlands. We are at ground zero. And governments have been pretty slow to respond, but they're doing it now. Now they do, most of them do. They feel an urgency to adapt. Some governments have had to change their zoning and building codes. State land purchasing programs had to consider what the land's going to look like, not when they buy it for $10 million, but what's it going to look like in 30 or 40 years. And so here's three things that we did in Sarasota. I just give you this as an idea of what adaptive management looks like, what adaptive resource management looks like. First, potable water supply. In Sarasota and much of Southwest Florida, we adapted to where we sourced our drinking water. Our usual source, the Floridan aquifer, was being overused, had reduced rates of recharge and reduced flows. And yet we get 59 inches of rainfall a year, Sarasota, where I live. So what we did was pull the plug mostly from the ground. We pulled the straw out of the ground. And now we capture the rain, we store it, and we pipe it to someone's faucet. It's sustainable and it's adaptive for now. Disappearing shorelines, big issue in Florida. When it came to coastal erosion, our first response was to sea level rise, was to prohibit new seawalls, and instead we embraced projects that pump sand on the beach, nourishment, it's called beach renourishment. But is that really economically and financially sustainable? Should governments continue to spend billions on beach renourishment projects to combat coastal erosion? Or do we move away from the beaches and build landward? I think it's a legitimate question to ask, and I stole this from John. Is this wasteful public spending masquerading as climate mitigation? Because climate mitigation is, well, how do we adapt? What do we do to mitigate these changes? A third area that we focused on was land preservation. I served on the board of the Conservation Foundation of Southwest Florida for many years, South Coast Florida. And it saves land through purchases and easements, over 12,000 acres so far. But we've adapted our purchasing and easement matrix to include sea level rise, because are the things that we're buying now and paying millions for, again, are they going to be there in 10 or 60 or 100 years? Maybe we should still protect it. I don't know. So, you look at biodiversity, you look at acidic oceans, warmer oceans, and businesses and governments are starting to adapt strategies to get there. Unfortunately, these, what I consider smart and enlightened approaches, have been pretty much trampled by Trump and his enablers. Federal employees are being told to roll back clean air and clean water standards. In fact, the words climate change in Florida couldn't even be used when we had Scott as our governor. That was forbidden. I mean, imagine something so large and important that you can't even use the name. So protections and policies that it's taken over 50 years to enact are being systematically eliminated. And we're at a real tipping point. And, I spent a lot of my time trying to enact some of these protections. I feel personally betrayed, but the society as a whole, mankind as a whole, has been betrayed. So this one brings me to why I really want to be on this panel and what I want to say to you today. It's the most important question we can ask. How do we use this information of climate to influence voters and to get Trump defeated? That's why we're here. At the end of the day, we have to get the average person to relate to everything we've just talked about. The guy or girl who says their eyes glass over when you say climate change. They go, well, that's your issue. That's not mine. Well, it is their issue. And how do you get them to see that? And we need to do two things as organizers and activists. First, we have to energize the voters that share our views and values along climate emergency issues. That's vitally important. That is so important. It can't be overemphasized. And secondly, we need to convince the small percentage of voters, which is about 7 to 9%, of true swing voters, how do they vote for our person and not Trump? Let me just talk about swing voters for a minute, because everyone in this group, everyone in this call is interested in talking to other people about how we're going to do this. The election will be decided, and we know this, I think most of us do, by a very few people in very few states. And Florida is one of those states. These few people they're grouped together, they're called swing voters. I'm not sure that's totally accurate, but they're people that are persuaded to vote often because of a particular issue. And they most normally identify as Republicans or independents, and they account for people who are not, they don't always vote, but they may turn out if they're motivated. On the average, these voters are younger, they're less partisan, and they're more moderate. Additionally, they are less politically engaged, with about 1/3 saying it doesn't matter who gets elected, it's the same garbage no matter what, versus 90% of those who've decided saying it matters a lot, like those on this call right now. So if you drill down a little deeper and you look at the 10% of Trump voters that say they could vote for someone else, you discover something that is really, really important. And it's good news for us and for the time we're spending right now talking about this. The good news is this: the evidence is clear and compelling that swing voters in Florida, particularly the 10% of Trump voters that say they might change their vote, they view his stance on climate and environment as one of two issues that would cause them to not vote for him. Only two. Immigration is the other. Let me just repeat that. Swing voters in Florida, and particularly the 10% Trump voters who might change their vote, view his stance on climate and environmental degradation as one of two issues that could cause them to not vote. And while, I would say, maybe many would say, there's a million reasons. Why would we just pick that? People that are on the electoral fence, they don't feel that way. He could be doing a lot of things they like. So we have to get over that and just focus on what we know. That's why we need to have a very specific picture painted of what the changes have been in Florida and what they look and what damage it's caused, especially to the swing voters, because many of them won't change their minds until they see an example of something. They have to be shown like, oh, really? That happened? I didn't know that. I don't pay that much attention. I don't really follow the news that much. Yeah, this is what's happened while we weren't following the news. We have to show them examples of degradation, environmental protection. This sounds very trite, but you have to show the pictures of dirty air. You have to show the pictures of birds covered with oil after a major blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. Algal blooms that we're seeing now on the east and west coast from the Okeechobee releases. So we have to highlight specific and actual examples of where these policies and actions are harming our environment. And that's one reason today's talk is so important. We are in a special place to be able to talk about that. In Florida, and this was brought up by someone else, we have a special challenge. And it was already mentioned by one of the speakers. There's a lot of truth to the Florida man caricature. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes it's a well-deserved reputation. Floridians often act in neurotic ways. The Florida Republican Party and Governor DeSantis in particular now publicly support many of the climate-related mitigation strategies that largely mirror the Democrats' position. Statewide, they have largely neutralized the issue among casual observers, not those that pay attention, but the casual observer. You'll hear more people say, we have an environmental governor. Well, they've broken with Trump because they know if they stay with him, they are dead. It's too an important issue in Florida. It's politically important in Florida, and they want to get reelected. So it's likely some voters that we might talk to will say, well, I think we're on the right page now. I'm not really worried. Whatever happens at the federal government. No, it does matter. The federal government can do enormous damage without having the state involved. The Republicans are talking a good show, but we haven't seen any real results of their conversion. And is this conversion real? So I like to talk about how we're going to beat this guy based on the facts that we have at hand based on the experts we're talking to right now. What are the things we should be talking about to people that don't pay attention? Most people, I shouldn't say most, 85% of the people have made up their mind. We've got a few people we've got to talk to, and this is an important discussion. So I'm interested in hearing what your questions are. I've talked long enough. Let me just say that I feel strongly that the issue of climate change and environmental degradation could be the key, to win the relatively small number of swing voters in Florida. And of course, that and the COVID epidemic, that's also a huge issue. And remember, this is so important. If we win Florida, we win. He's gone. He doesn't come back. If you win Florida in this election, you've won the presidency. So based on that, thank you for listening. I think this is a really important discussion, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you, Rob. I think it's also important to appreciate that while the distinctions in this election on climate policy are pretty clear, you know, the Democrats don't have clean hands historically on this either. And the political landscape is always shifting. So when you vote for one candidate, people tend to stick with that candidate through thick or thin, when in fact, you know, it's really to everyone's advantage to focus on the issues and vote on the issues more than allegiance to a party or an individual. So you know, right now we've got some very stark policy choices, and you know, the information that's been shared here today has been very helpful, in my opinion. I'd like, you know, we've talked about the economics and the politics of it. I'd like to return to Valholly, who's pursuing it through the legal mechanisms, which is another channel available in our democracy. And Valholly, what's your assessment when you look at politics, you know, grassroots activism, you know, in the streets, and legal channels? What are you learning about the relative merits or the viability of those various approaches in addressing the climate emergency? How do you think it's going in the courts relative to addressing this emergency?
I think, at least in the federal court, I'm on the state case, but in the federal court, they're dismissing it, saying like, oh, well, we can't really do anything. We can't do anything to change climate policy, but they can order these organizations to do things to stop increasing the effects of climate change. They just find these really sly ways to get around what we need to do. And it's a thing I've noticed in a lot of ways, because when I learn about history and what's happened in the past, like with an example like racism, like when I learned about history, racism was so in your face, it was so apparent. It's like, yeah, these people are racist and these people weren't as racist or they weren't racist. But today, racism is concealed with different things. Like, it's such a sneaky way to show racism, and it's caused for this argument of, oh, they're making everything out to be a race issue. And it's a thing I hear in the climate movement too, that these radical fear-mongering leftists are making climate into a race issue, but it's a humanitarian issue. But these people in power, they are just pointing fingers, and they aren't facing these problems the way they need to. And we're doing so much to fix that. And of course, I can't vote and I can't go out and exercise my civil liberties for another year. But suing is this way that I found a new form of power. I've been with a lot of these groups who fight for the climate movement and fight for social justice. And it's so amazing. These movements, when you get enough people, they're so inspiring and they're so amazing. And I think they do create a lot of change, but it's really slow and it's hard to keep that momentum throughout the years, because as soon as you gain notice of these issues, once you show the public that these things are happening, it's hard to keep their attention on it. It's really hard to keep people interested and keep people passionate about these issues, even though they're going to continue for many, many, many years. And that's the thing I'm seeing in the courts too. They keep trying to dismiss our case, in Florida especially. They've tried to dismiss it twice. It's been going on for 2 years, and we only now have a court hearing on June 1st. And for that court hearing, the there's a website called Our Children's Trust, and I will link them after I'm finished. And there's a specific Florida one, and there is a call to action page, and it's to show your support, to show that you stand with the plaintiffs in the Reynolds versus the state of Florida case. And there it is in the chat. And that's just to add your name to show that you know the case and that you support the kids in this case and you support the lawyers and you support the cause.
Valholly, I went to that website, to Our Children's Trust, and I was very interested to see that they had video files of the oral arguments in the Ninth Circuit. And it seemed to me that they were pursuing justice with a little j, not a capital J. They were focused on the minutia and these minor issues of law. They seemed bewildered by anyone asking them to do something actually big. And it was a split decision, 2-1. And I don't want to sound sexist, but it seemed that the woman was much more sensitive to these larger issues of capital J justice than the other 2 judges. And I'm wondering if you think that, you know, diversifying our court system will have a significant impact on that, not just by gender or race, but by attitude. And, you know, we see that's a constant swing of politics. But what's your sense of going to some of these meetings and looking at the gender aspects and some of these other dimensions on the climate emergency issue?
I think although sometimes, like, it's not made out to seem like that, sometimes people, although they look white or they are a guy, they don't realize the privilege they do have. Like the white privilege, it's very apparent. I definitely take advantage of that white privilege a lot because I just notice it a lot. I know a lot of my classmates and a lot of people I meet, if they have darker skin tones, no matter what race they are, it's a lot harder for them to do normal things. Like, it's just not as easy when you're not white or when you don't look white. Because I'm Native American, I'm partially white, but I really have that light, fair skin tone, and I think it benefits me a lot. Although I'm a woman, I think it's much easier for me to get by and for me to have my voice heard than a lot of these other people. And it's really hard for people, and I think a great thing about the climate movement is that we try to highlight people who aren't the classic white male that you always see. Sometimes you don't want to use this white privilege, you don't really want it, and sometimes you don't realize that you have it. Sometimes you don't realize that you are at an advantage because of your skin tone. And I think that blindness to your advantage that you have just because of the way you were born, that's what causes a lot of the ignorance today. Because people of darker skin tone than me, they could have struggled more than me just because of what they look like, and I wouldn't even know. You really have to educate yourself. You really have to go in and understand these people and understand what they go through, or else you can never move forward. You have to highlight these issues as someone with that white privilege, as someone who gets their voice heard. I love to highlight the issues that are out there because these minority voices are not heard in the way that they have to be heard. I think we need a lot of diversifying, and it's become a bigger thing now that people are not as trusting or not as giving to the white male in some of these radical movements. There was a lot of things I saw about how Democrats say how accepting they are, but the 2 nominees they had were two old white men. And I do think we need more diversity. I think we just need to highlight the voices of those who struggle, whether they know it or not, whether people know it or not. There is a difference. There is racism, there is sexism, there is homophobia, and that can just be based on what you look like. And sometimes you don't realize you have an advantage or you're at a disadvantage, but it's harder to see that if you are the one who's at an advantage because of it.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting observations and comments. I'd like to switch over to one of the written questions that we had received. Let me see if I can share the screen here. And I think this first question would best be directed to Rob and Mark in sequence. First Rob and then Mark. Rob offering sort of a practical perspective on the answer, and then Rob maybe a more structural answer. And this was submitted by email, and the question goes, why does this area, meaning the coastal areas of Florida, keep building more properties of opportunity for richer folks to buy when we don't have enough affordable housing or even hurricane shelters, and we can only expect more flooding as climate change increases? And what can we do to affect these development choices on the local level? And in addition to that, I'd like to offer, an observation. Like many of us, I'll go down to Miami, downtown Miami from time to time, and they're building these most incredible structures, 50, 60 stories, top of the line technology, massive concrete structures, things that will have a durable lifespan of easily 200 years. But they're being built on land that's 3 feet or less above sea level. And the question is, these investors are looking at a return on investment, and how does that happen? So first, maybe Rob, maybe you can address this question.
Well, yeah, after, having been involved in this forever, you never want to confuse governmental permitting and action with common sense, because since I can remember, Florida has been about who has the most money and who gets to get access to the politicians. We do have, once in a while, we get people that have sensibilities, that have hearts, that know that we need to put more money into affordable housing. I know that's important. Right now, we get lip service to it. I mean, I think affordable housing, and Mark probably knows this better than I do, is something like $200 and something thousand. It's an amazing amount of money. So basically, it's the result of capitalism fully at work. These people are getting the laws passed that allow them to do the things that don't make sense, that are environmentally destructive, and then for the long term, they're not sustainable. And it really gets back to, I think, you have to locally get people in office that share your point of view, that share your sensibilities, that share your passions. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that right now.
So Mark, might you take a shot at
yeah, these are really good questions. So they're related, but I think it's important to keep in mind that our government is large and complex, so they do come from two slightly different wings of the government. First, I'd point out, as kind of Rob alluded to here, we live in a capitalist system. And when we talk about capitalism, though, there's many flavors of capitalism. We don't live in a purely capitalist society, nor, for instance, when people look at the Scandinavian countries, these are not socialist countries. Those are also capitalist countries. But we all live in what I refer to as a mixed economy, where in some countries like the United States, many more things are privy to the market than in other countries where you might take some things out of the purview of the market. For instance, in many other countries like Germany, Finland, Sweden, Norway, et cetera, where they protect people from the market to a much greater degree. So that, that said, I think I think Rob's totally right that, we live in this relatively unregulated market system in the United States, where the rules are such that people can build in areas that are not literally going to be underwater in the next 30 or 50 years. And unfortunately, not only are people allowed to do such activities, but they're actually encouraged and subsidized to do so. Right now in the United States, we have national flood insurance policies where the government largely subsidizes high-end houses built in flood-prone areas, rather than having smart climate policies that simply say we can't, we need to protect these areas, preserve the few mangroves we have left, and cease building in flood-prone regions. So at the end of the day, these are policy choices, which is again why elections matter so much. So on the other hand, the affordable housing question, I've worked with an amazing group of activists to create a call to action around what we call a homes guarantee. So this has been written up in the New York Times and many other outlets, and was also endorsed by a number of the 2020 Democratic candidates, where, it's kind of a plan to actually once and for all end homelessness in the United States through massive investments in public housing, which also include decarbonizing that housing stock. And the second thing I'll mention is I worked with a member of Congress to create what we call a Green New Deal for American public housing communities across the US, which also polled very well, particularly with Democratic voters. Where we would simply decarbonize the entire public housing stock and expand it here in the U.S. So that's actually there's a current bill on this in Congress that was introduced by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So this is the same thing, where it's really a policy choice where we allow homelessness to persist. I was just reading yesterday Michael Harrington's The Other America that was written in 1962. That was unfortunately, before many of our lifetimes began, myself included. And he's talking about the persistent homelessness and the persistent inadequacy of many of the dwellings that currently exist in the United States. What if I were to tell you that we have enough dwellings, we have enough homes for every single person in the US to have an adequate home? The problem is how we distribute those homes. So I lived downtown Sarasota last year. I moved to a different neighborhood in Sarasota. But when I lived downtown, I'd look out on my balcony and I'd look at all the high rises. And every given night, about 80%, except for during peak season, of those high rises are just black, right? Nobody lives in them. They're not people's second homes even. They're usually people's third, fourth, fifth homes. So it's a distributional question. It's not about, can we build enough homes? We can do that. We've already done it. If you actually look at the statistics, we have enough homes for every single family in America to have a home, and we'd still have millions of homes left over. It's how we decide to distribute the current resources that we have. And unfortunately, we've decided to distribute them in a way that leave tens of millions of Americans either homeless or housing insecure. Right now, about half of Americans are renters, and of that half of Americans, half of them are what we call rent burdened. In other words, they literally can't afford their rent on a regular basis, according to the US government definition. And there's a lot of things that we could do to try to address that problem, which would include simultaneously addressing the climate problem. So as I mentioned earlier, retrofitting all houses in the United States. I come from Massachusetts, where we had an amazing home retrofit program. The state of Massachusetts would come to your house and provide you with up to $7,500 of insulation and energy efficiency work, basically for free. If you're a high income resident, you'd have to engage in cost sharing, but for middle and low income resident, they do it for free. There's no reason that states like Florida couldn't push for such programs as well.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Rob. I'd like to switch to a question that, it's a matter that both Rock and Mark brought up, and I think it warrants maybe some additional exploration. And that's, let's see. And that has to do with the Michael Moore movie. And, I'm fairly sensitive to some of the negative portrayals that I thought were somewhat unfair quite unfair in the movie. I'm a waterkeeper, and that organization is led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and the movie took a shot at him. And I think a lot of that was taken out of context, but there's some elements of truth in that. And it speaks to some of the things Rock was talking about as far as the numbers. I did a Department of Energy study here in Florida back in 2012, looking at biofuels. and how much sense they made or did not make. And things like ethanol and forestry products, sugarcane and such, they can actually be quite destructive. And that was somewhat of the message of the movie. So how do we, Rock, how do we internalize these legitimate numerical quantitative arguments without buying into the hack job that Mark points out that much of this movie entailed?
I suppose a lot of the efforts will have to be from the grassroots organizations sticking to the science. And a lot of it will be, like I mentioned before, retooling our universities to pursue the numbers and construct actual goals, deadlines, and plans of action for politicians to follow. A lot of issues that we have, specifically in Tallahassee, are issues with connecting voters with scientists and then connecting those educated opinions to the politicians in Tallahassee to put together platforms to successfully work on our issues here in Florida. But part of that is also that we simply don't control Tallahassee right now. There are simply too many Republicans in both the Florida House and the Florida Senate to actually do anything anything of note and worth, even if we have the science. So
now, when you say Republicans, what you're really saying is that people, specific politicians who don't support aggressive environmental legislation, because you and I both looked at report cards, and there's some overlap in a few cases of politicians from other parties that also are not doing what we might see as the ideal approach on environmental policy. So I think it's always important to characterize these folks based upon their voting record rather than their affiliations.
And I suppose that goes back to remembering that this is a numbers game based on that idea. Once we have the vote tallies and we do have the vote records, which I know you and I have worked on in the past, we can see the politicians that actually are out there saying they will do something constructive for the environment, and those who actually follow through with such statements instead of greenwashing or worse, or even worse than that. So yes, it's a combination of both retooling our universities to put scientists to work on producing the means of accomplishing our immense and monumental task, and also electing the right politicians.
Talk a little bit about, expanding on that, the science. You brought to my attention an initiative by a particular legislator on carbon farming.
Yes, Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he is an excellent senator from Broward County that I've worked with extensively up in Tallahassee on a couple of the issues up there. I was senior environmental analyst for the Florida Senate up there for the minority office specifically. And we are currently, and Dr. Capece too, have been tasked with working with him to create a carbon farming program here in Florida, or exploring the options of how Florida could benefit from a carbon farming program here in Florida.
And, years ago, we developed water storage, water farming. And unfortunately, the corporate interest kind of gamed this very productive concept into something that, bared little resemblance to its original intent by manipulating the rules. And I think that kind of speaks to some things brought up in the Michael Moore movie. And I'd like to hear Mark now elaborate on some of the legitimate criticisms of that movie, and then what he might see as some nuggets worthy of internalizing from it as well.
So thanks for the question. I mean, to be honest, I'm going to take the time to briefly mention the Moore movie, but I just don't think it's worth the airtime. I think it does a disservice to the movement, and I don't think it's even of the quality to kind of give it too much attention. I mean, the biggest issue are twofold. One is that it simply doesn't cite any of the recent evidence. So it's not interviewing any of the top experts that are publishing in the top journals. I totally agree that we need to be listening to the scientists. As an economist, the role that I see for myself is that the economists the scientists tell us where we're heading and what we need to do, in terms of reducing emissions. And then as an economist, my job is to think about, okay, well, how do we address those emissions reductions in a way that supports broad-based economic prosperity, rather than thinking about a program of decarbonization leading us to a great recession, which is what many people fear. And for understandable reasons. Not that it will occur, but that if it's done poorly, there could be significant challenges. The one thing I'll say is that no group, environmentalists included, should be should be immune from criticism. For instance, biofuels, I think, have largely in many instances, biofuels have been a mistake. If you look at ethanol and gasoline, for instance, it's something that should be repealed. It's something that was won over not by the big environmentalists, but by the big corn lobby. If you look at biofuels, same thing. A lot of times talking about biomass, this is something that was not a victory by environmentalists. It was a victory by the logging industry. So it's important that we think carefully about the trade-offs that exist, and that we think carefully about kind of who's behind a lot of the current green technologies that are being deployed. If you talk to most climate scientists and environmental experts, for instance, the biggest area that you'll see them diverge with traditional green groups is over nuclear. So that's why you frequently hear about clean and renewable energy versus just renewable energy, right? Those are two different things. Clean also allows nuclear as well as some other technologies as well. And if you talk to the scientists, the vast majority of scientists will tell you that nuclear energy is absolutely necessary, at least for the transition. So for instance, I'm somebody who strongly advocates for keeping existing nuclear plants open. I just do not like nuclear. I'm by no means a nuclear advocate. However, if we want to be real about reaching environmental goals of decarbonizing the US economy by 2050 at the absolute latest, then it seems it seems to make a very challenging problem about twice as hard if we are to take out the base load that is nuclear. So I think that's where I'll leave it. That said, I think that constant introspection is really important, and that we need to be critical both of the movement in order to make it stronger. So I do think that we should continue to think along those lines.
One follow-up sort of question has to do with the full portfolio of economic measures that are necessary to move toward a decarbonized economy. You talked about the lost opportunities of the Obama administration, and it seems that the Obama and the Congress at that time used their political capital, which had a very limited window, and they focused it on Obamacare, on medical coverage. Could you speak to the role that universal health care would play in a decarbonizing economy relative to employment mobility?
Yeah, so a few things. Really good question. Thank you for that. So first is there's kind of this major piece that was written about 10 years back on why Waxman Markey failed. And here's a really good, worthwhile article to check out on that. A lot of people thought that Obama's political capital would only allow him to achieve one victory, and that he put that victory into the Affordable Care Act, what we colloquially refer to as the Obamacare. I'm not sure that's right at all. And I encourage people to think about why Waxman Markey failed, because if we're going to pass another major piece of green climate legislation, we should certainly understand why previous ones have been put into the dustbin of history. One of the challenges here is just that politicians have never had a major, a major PAC, a major organization, large-scale organized activists actually behind green movements. So yes, there's dozens upon dozens of fantastic environmental groups that are becoming much more engaged politically, but these are very new. I mean, if we think back to 350.org was only started less than a decade ago. If you think about a lot of the fantastic environmental justice groups that are in existence. I mean, unfortunately, they're very small and largely very poorly funded because they don't, they're not in the pocketbooks of the Koch brothers and others. So I think that money, in politics is a very real and pressing issue that we need to continue to be aware of and think about how to battle appropriately. In terms of healthcare, I mean, there's various proposals to bolster healthcare. Right now, we have passed the Affordable Care Act, yet we still have tens of millions of Americans that are both uninsured and underinsured. One of the most important things is providing universal economic security. I am a pretty firm believer that until we provide economic security, it's going to be very challenging to actually address our pressing climate issues. I don't think these things are separable, and I don't think that until we actually show coal workers, the only 45,000 that exist still, which is funny, just on a small tangent. Coal workers always get brought up as a very politically important group. If I asked you all if you thought J.C. Penney workers were very important, most of you would say no, but most of you would also be surprised to learn that J.C. Penney employs 5 times as many employees as the entire coal industry does in the United States. So we're really talking about a relatively small group of workers, but of course they're politically powerful, A, because they're unionized, and B, because they're in small states where their congressional members are relatively beholden to that group. Think of Mitch McConnell, for instance. But if we actually help provide these people with economic security, them knowing that they're going to get a union job that has a pension and has health benefits, I think you're going to see many, many fossil fuel workers join the fights here. Because at the end of the day, fossil fuel jobs are dirty and dangerous jobs. Nobody wants to go into a coal mine. Far too many people have lost family members either in the mines directly or from diseases associated with working in these mines. These are jobs that should be eliminated as quickly as possible, but we need a smart transition plan in place that includes things like healthcare, pensions, and well-paying jobs on the other side to make sure that workers will trust in us. And unfortunately, we've basically done everything possible to harm that trust. So thinking about trade adjustment assistance as part of NAFTA is a really good analogy and reason why workers are fairly distrusting of government's ability to help them transition and ensure that they're kept whole.
Well, thank you for that. The next question, I'd like to redirect it back over toward sort of the activism, the movements. And so I'd like to hear from both Rob and Rock and Valholly on this. First, the UN conference was originally to be held in Chile. Then it had to move to Madrid, Spain. Why? Because of political instability, because to a certain extent, environmental justice, economic justice, all of the things that are going to be exacerbated by climate change. And when you talk to the UN officials, they say, yeah, there's sea level rise, but we can get out of the way. What we can't get out of the way of is people in motion and people angry and people picking up basically pitchforks when they're stressed on the food and economic front. So, we've got a limited window until climate change destabilizes things to the extent that we lose our capacity. But in the short term, maybe we need some of that destabilization to shake up the current governance system, whether it's the judiciary or the legislative or the executive or corporate. And Rob, how do you see people evolving from their current state? And do you think they're ready to really mobilize and demand political action? And then I'd like Rock to talk about that as well, and Valholly from the experience they had in Madrid with some protests.
Well, I hope so. And I think that if nothing else, and I'll get right back on point with, what we need to do. If nothing else, we have to change the political makeup. There's no magic. I'm not a lifelong anything. I don't believe all Democrats or Republicans are good or bad. The facts are that right now we have someone that is president and a number of people, whatever party, that are enabling him, that our discussions at some point become playful but not really meaningful, because unless we get the right people in there, we're going to have a really sad discussion, 6 or 7 months from now. So yeah, I think that if nothing else, this horrendous guy in the White House has mobilized people that were not necessarily mobilized before. I think he's energized people that were not necessarily energized before. And we're going to have to just hope that that carries through with the general electorate and especially in 4 or 5 swing states. So I hate to keep going back to my political science background and saying, okay, here's what we got to do to win. But honestly, if we don't, and I say we as people that care about the environment, care about affordable housing, care about fossil fuel propagation, fossil fuel for energy, if we care about that, we can have the same conversation later, and it will be playful, but it won't be meaningful unless we can get rid of the one guy that we need to get rid of as a start, and then move on down the line. So you asked, I think your question was, do you see a resurgent? One quick thing, and many people that are younger than you and I, John, may not know that probably the largest environmental president in our ever.
I hear it coming.
Yeah, Dick Nixon or JFK. Dick Nixon had the EPA, fresh water and clean water and fresh air. These were all things that we pushed for back in the 60s. We fought for, and the politicians were listening, and they did all of this. And now all the rules that promulgated out of that came from that particular era. And that's why it's so frustrating. It's so frustrating to see it unravel the way it's unraveling after all the fighting that we went through, all the work we did. I think Valholly started our conversation by saying it's hard sometimes to get motivated if you don't have the experiences to know what was there before. She made some excellent points, and thank God for people like her and others that are on this call that are mobilizing and are making a difference. It's only going to happen if we change the people. We've got to move the chess pieces right now.
Rock, maybe you can, talk a little bit about some of the activism that occurred within the context of a very sort of orderly and governmental structure of COP gathering there in Madrid.
It was kind of interesting. A couple of times there was almost violent demonstrations that occurred in Madrid with regard to a lot of the young people who were attending, who consistently day by day saw their hopes from day one, which were quite hopeful that we would be following up on Katowice and Paris and continuously push for more innovative solutions for climate change. And throughout the 14-day conference, you could see day by day the hopes of the young people continuously going downhill as, again, history repeated itself. Time and time again, we saw how a lot of these major issues, the limitations of greenhouse gases, the corporations consistently refused, or worse yet, demanded extra subsidies or help with their own particular companies or countries. And the young people just by 7 days in were quite furious. A couple of times they sat in on the actual UN conference. They were actually, they broke into the conference center, and the security guards had to haul a few people away. I even heard that there was a couple who were arrested. That was quite exciting. But the idea is...
I even heard that there was some young man who moved into a hall and kind of took over the US delegation desk. I won't name names, but...
I won't confirm or deny that ever took place. I mean, they weren't there anyway, so it was anyone's game to show up at the US desk. So, they couldn't really arrest that kid, whoever he was. But yeah, long story short, I personally think that social revolution, or like the social angst that we saw in so many young people, is extraordinary, not just important, but it's necessary to impress upon some of the older generations attending these conferences, specifically the politicians who are there to advance their own career goals, that we're not going away. Us young people, this is our planet that's going to be suffering the most from these major issues. And to frame this, in the context of a social revolution is necessary. And like I believe it was JFK who said, those who prevent social revolution from happening make sure that that violent revolution becomes inevitable. And with climate change, it's even more pressing now, because this, by the time the climate change is impacting all of us, it'll be far too late to deal with some of the root problems of climate change. We'll be so busy dealing with the symptoms of climate change, such as heat stress or moving people from one location to another. All of our resources will be going into mitigating the symptoms of climate change, that we really won't have any resources to deal with the root problems that come from climate change. Therefore, all of the jobs that, all of you who are listening to this phone call, who are on Organizing 2020, who see this as, your opportunity to impact the election, it really is our moment to shine. It really is the moment for young and old people to really unite and impress upon a lot of the voters the need to do something about this right now. Use our momentum and social revolution now to actually impact the planet, or else we will be only dealing with the symptoms of the issue in 10 and 20 and 30 years down the road. Whereas now we at least have the leeway, and we have the luxury of resources to put together a coalition with young and old and everyone in between to solve these issues on a much larger scale and grand scale now, rather than waiting 20 years where we simply will not have the resources to deal with the root cause of the issues.
Thank you, Rock. Valholly, maybe you can talk a little bit about the same theme and kind of wrap things up for us here with your youthful perspective.
One thing I did want to touch on, Rock talked about the protests. There was one protest near the end of the climate talks, and it was a huge protest with a lot of the youth, and they were saying that these conferences are going nowhere, they're not doing enough, and not enough action is being taken. And it was this giant protest, so many people, and then some people marched and they walked out of the main halls, and then security kicked the rest out. They kicked all the protesters out and stripped them of their badges, and they weren't allowed to attend the rest of the talks. And it was just such a blatant display of silencing, because, I think people think, bipartisanship, it's so divided and it's so extreme that people think, oh, if you are on the left, or you label yourself as a Democrat, or you are a Democrat, that you agree with all of those democratic issues. Or some people think that, if you're on the right, oh, you must be a Trump supporter or something. But there's people who care more deeply about certain things, or there's people who don't care as much about certain things. And these labels don't encompass everything these individual people feel. And these people were literally unable to attend the rest of these talks because they didn't believe these talks were doing enough. And it was terrible. I wasn't there for it because I had to come back here. I had to go back to school. But it was terrible to hear about, especially since I knew some people who were there who were going through that. There's just so much silencing nowadays, and they try to hide it, but sometimes it doesn't get hidden the way that they want it to. It was really hard to go to that climate talk because I was really hopeful. I was one of those really blissfully unaware of how little would get done. I was one of those people. And I was so ready to see so much change happening, but it didn't happen. I saw officials there from the United States who weren't doing enough about climate over in this country, and then they were going all the way to Madrid, and they were trying to talk about how much of an issue it is, how much of a crisis it is. They say all these words and they talk their talk, but they don't own up to it. They don't stand up to what they say. They don't do what they could do. And I don't know if they just think that they can't, or they don't think they'd have the support to be able to do it, but they're not doing what they can and what they should, and that's what everybody here wants, I'm guessing, and I'm hoping. And it's really cool to be able to talk about this and to see so many people so interested in it.
Well, thank you, Valholly, for an eloquent sort of commentary on what transpired there, and the same story as so many of the previous meetings. So I'd like to thank Valholly and Rock and Rob and Dr. Mark Paul for participating in this panel. I think there's more questions and discussion we can hold, but I think, you know, we've done a good job of covering much of the general topic. And I'd like to turn it back over at this time to Lily.
Thank you, John. That was wonderful, you guys. Once again, thanks everyone for coming. Before we head out, I want to really quickly hand it over to the Regional Organizing Director of Organizing Together 2020 for our immediate area here in Southwest Florida to quickly talk about some of the next steps for our organization and what you can do to immediately get involved. Obviously, our mission is not entirely what we've just spoken about, but it is incredibly important with this presidential election coming up. So I'm going to pass it over to Matt Jones.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yep.
All right, great.
I can hear you.
So I just want to thank everybody, our panelists, everybody who joined us online. We are making a recording of this talk tonight, and we have been streaming it online. So if you want to share this, it is available, and we will be following up with everybody after this event. But in terms of next steps, you know, we learned a lot of great information tonight, and you know, the next steps are basically, what are we going to do? And one thing that was brought up a couple times is the importance of voting, and the election is only getting closer. So time is one of our most precious resources where we need to capitalize on the time that we still do have left. And people are ready to go, and we need to handle everything that's happening in our environments and our communities, especially with this public health crisis, in a way that's going to make sure that people are ready to vote and they have secure ways to do so. So one thing that our organization is really focused on is Florida specifically. This was brought up a couple of times. Florida is known as a battleground state. So for those, if that term is new to you, basically in 2016, Donald Trump won the state by just 1.2% of the vote. In 2018, Ron DeSantis was elected governor by less than half of 1 point. And then former Governor Rick Scott defeated Senator Bill Nelson by just over 10,000 votes. So, I mean, just a few individuals can really swing this election. And in 2020, the 29 electoral votes have always basically been the deciding factor. And I think Rob spoke on this earlier. If we win Florida, we win the White House. So doing what we can while we still have the time between now and November is absolutely critical. And what we're really encouraging folks to look into is voting by mail. I don't want to get too deep into the details about voting by mail, but in Florida, there's 3 ways to vote. You can vote on election day, you can vote early, and every voter in Florida can request a vote by mail ballot, which is mailed plenty of weeks in advance, which gives people a great opportunity to really vote on the issues, to do their research, and vote from the safety of their own home. And studies have shown that vote by mail increases turnout. I won't go too deep into this, but we do have numbers just to kind of highlight voter turnout in Florida. This is just a very quick breakdown based on demographics, where you can see the youth population between 18 to 35 across the board. You're looking at about 55%. And then as it goes up as a total, you see a voter turnout of 77%, which is well above average for most states, but still not where we need to be, and especially in regards to youth voter turnout. And if you look at vote by mail statistics, of the folks who requested ballots, of those who were mailed, overwhelmingly between Lee and Sarasota counties, you're seeing at least 85% of voters returning their ballots by mail. So as we really encourage and do a lot of outreach for getting folks enrolled in vote by mail, we're going to see the likelihood of voters voting go up exponentially. We have a website. It's Florida Votes, VOTES, bymail.com. Anybody in the state of Florida can go to this website. It will basically directly connect them to their supervisor of elections site, so they can actually have a portal access to request a ballot. And just so you know, you can also register your spouse, your parent, your child, grandparent, or sibling to also receive a vote by mail ballot. The last day for the general election to request a ballot will be October 24th by 5 p.m. And you can also return your ballot in person on election day. And even if you do request a ballot, you can always still vote early or in person on election day. Just to let you know what our program has been up to, since we got started back in mid-March, we've made over 175,000 phone calls. We're sending nearly 200,000 text messages, and we're growing an organization that's going to be ready to go for the general election. And as of right now, we've already had over 1,300 people step up to volunteer, and we've had one-on-one meetings with over 1,100 Floridians virtually. So just because we can't meet in person doesn't mean we can't still do the very important work that needs to happen before Election Day. So in order to join us, what does that mean? That means we can make calls from home. We can send text messages. We can do digital organizing on social media. And you are joined tonight by over 12 organizers who are across Southwest Florida who are happy to meet with you almost every day of the week. We have weekly group trainings to really talk about the ways that you can get involved and so make a difference to make sure that voters vote on the issues and actually start to move us in the right direction and focus on fixing the problems. And just with that, I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. If anybody here would like to get more questions answered or get in touch with some of our speakers, feel free to reach out to us. And please share this very informative video. And these panelists spoke so eloquently and in such detail about these issues that more and more people need to hear this. So we hope to do something like this again in the future, but I just want to say thank you again for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.
Certainly. Thank you, John. And thank you, Lily, very much. And you as well, Matt. And Rob, as you as well. And Valholly, if she's still around here too. And all the other organizers.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you all for the opportunity. That was great.
Thank you.
Well, Lily, congratulations. You did a great job
Thank you so
pulling
much.
this together. I mean, I thought it went very well.
Let me stop recording.
Yeah, Lily, if you want to take it off Facebook too.
Yeah.